From the moment I discovered I was pregnant, I felt a mix of terror and excitement that most expectant mothers feel. I was 25 and had been married for just under 2 years. My husband and I had deliberately waited until we felt ready, and when that positive test finally came, we were genuinely happy. However, I could never have anticipated the mess that would unravel with my own mother. She'd always been protective, but never in my wildest imagination did I think she'd try to steal my baby. This happened last year, and the fallout has been devastating, albeit freeing. I grew up in a household that revolved around my younger sister, Emily. She was a high achiever, a social butterfly, and according to our mother, destined for greatness. Whenever I accomplished something, my mother's first comment would usually revolve around how Emily might do it even better. I eventually got used to it, finished high school, went to college, and met the man who'd become my husband. There were no major arguments or rifts, but my mother's favoritism was always there, simmering beneath the surface. When Emily got engaged, my mother became even more intense about everything. I announced my pregnancy a few weeks after Emily set her wedding date. I was about 3 months along at the time. My family seemed happy overall. My dad gave me a big hug, and Emily squealed with delight. But my mother had a weird expression I couldn't read. She forced a smile, congratulated me, then immediately asked if my due date would interfere with Emily's wedding. I told her it wouldn't because Emily was getting married in the late summer and my baby was due in early spring. In theory, there'd be several months difference, so no direct conflict. Over the next few months, my mother's behavior became erratic. She complained that my pregnancy was overshadowing Emily's engagement, even though nobody else seemed to think so. She refused to accompany me to any prenatal checkups and kept urging me not to mention the baby too much around Emily. My sister, for her part, didn't seem bothered at all. She was thrilled to become an aunt. But my mother kept pushing this idea that all eyes had to be on Emily, and I should know better than to steal the spotlight. It made family gatherings incredibly awkward. Right before I gave birth, Emily's wedding planning was in full swing. My mother was running around picking venues, tasting cakes, and yelling at florists. She refused to talk about my baby at all. At my baby shower, which was organized by my best friend, my mother showed up late, gave me an obviously re-gifted item, and left early. She called me the next day and reminded me not to get too comfy with the attention since the wedding was only a few months away. I chalked it up to her typical obsession with Emily and tried to shrug it off. My son arrived without complications. The day I went into labor, my mother didn't pick up her phone. My father visited us at the hospital, but my mother was conspicuously absent. Emily came by briefly, apologized for our mom, and said she was busy with wedding stuff. I tried not to let it bother me. My son was healthy, and that was all that mattered. I posted a quick birth announcement online, which got a lot of positive feedback from friends and family. That same evening, I received a cold text from my mother. "Don't show him off too much." 2 weeks after we brought my son home, I got a call from a local adoption agency. At first, I assumed it was a telemarketer or some spam call, but the woman on the line mentioned specific details, my name, my husband's name, and even my baby's name, asking if we were proceeding with the adoption plan we'd initiated. I was stunned. I told her she had to be mistaken. She insisted she had our information, all properly submitted with forms that had my forged signature on them. She asked if I still wanted to proceed. I immediately hung up and called my husband, who was equally shocked. We agreed that this had to be some sick joke or a mistake. But I was too unsettled to ignore it, so we drove to the agency in person. The staff there looked uncomfortable when we arrived. They handed me photocopies of forms that supposedly bore my signature. It was a sloppy imitation of my handwriting, but enough to fool someone who didn't know me well. My blood ran cold when I saw my mother's name listed as the person assisting with the arrangement. She had done this. I confronted my mother that same evening. I called her repeatedly until she picked up. She acted clueless at first, feigning ignorance about everything. When I mentioned the adoption agency by name, she let out a heavy sigh and told me to stop overreacting. She said I was too young, not financially stable enough, and that having a baby just before Emily's wedding would create unwanted drama. She insisted my baby was better off with another family. The calmness in her voice was chilling, as though she genuinely believed she was doing something noble. I felt sick to my stomach. That night, I was too furious to sleep. my husband and I talked about our options. My first instinct was to cut her off entirely and never look back, but the gravity of what she did went beyond a personal grudge. She forged documents in an attempt to give my baby away. That was criminal. We also suspected she might try something else. If she was capable of forging signatures, who knew what else she might do? So we contacted a lawyer the next day. He was appalled by the story and immediately helped us file the necessary paperwork. I informed my father about what was going on. He was horrified and said he had no idea my mother was doing any of this. He knew she was fixated on Emily's wedding, but he never believed she'd go that far. Emily was also shocked and offered to talk to our mother, but we advised her not to get involved beyond providing moral support. We wanted a clear line of action that wouldn't be muddled by family drama. The lawyer guided us through obtaining an emergency protection order to prevent my mother from making any further attempts at interfering. Within a week, I received an angry phone call from my mother. She screeched at me for dragging the family name through the mud by involving a lawyer. She also demanded I drop everything because Emily's wedding is soon and we don't need this scandal. I told her we were done speaking unless it was through legal channels. She tried to guilt trip me, claiming she was only doing what was best for me and my baby. I hung up. A few days later, I was served with official documents indicating my mother was disputing the protection order. The hearing for the protection order was scheduled. My mother showed up with a lawyer she'd apparently hired at great expense. She argued that she'd never intended to actually go through with the adoption and that it was all a misunderstanding. The judge listened quietly. Our lawyer presented the documents from the adoption agency, the forged signatures, and testimony from the agency staff. My mother's lawyer tried to cast doubt on the authenticity of the signatures, but it was an uphill battle. The judge granted the protection order, citing that there was substantial evidence of my mother's misconduct. After the protection order was in place, I started getting calls from extended family, all repeating the same plea. "It's almost Emily's wedding. Can't you just let it go for now?" They didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what my mother had done. Forging documents to put my child up for adoption wasn't a small mishap. Some relatives thought I was overreacting. I stopped taking their calls. My focus was on safeguarding my baby and ensuring my mother faced consequences. When the district attorney contacted me regarding possible criminal charges, I cooperated fully. I wanted justice. Emily's wedding arrived. I didn't attend. My mother was still under a protection order, and I wanted no drama. I sent Emily a heartfelt message, apologizing for missing her big day, but explaining I couldn't risk any confrontation. She understood, though I could sense her disappointment. Meanwhile, my mother played the martyr at the wedding, telling anyone who would listen that I was hell-bent on ruining Emily's special moment. A few cousins texted me, saying they heard my mother ranting, but by then, I'd grown numb to the gossip. My priority was my family's safety and peace. After the wedding, my mother apparently thought I'd back down. She was wrong. The criminal investigation proceeded. The district attorney gathered evidence that included statements from the adoption agency, the forged documents, and phone records showing repeated contact between my mother and the agency. I provided every scrap of communication I had, including her text messages. My mother's lawyer tried to argue she was under stress due to wedding preparations and acted irrationally, but that didn't excuse forging legal paperwork to put a baby up for adoption. The prosecution pushed forward, and soon charges were formally filed against her. When my mother was arrested, she posted bail almost immediately. My extended family erupted in chaos. Some said I was tearing the family apart. Others quietly supported me, saying they'd always known my mother had a cruel streak but never expected it to go this far. My father was heartbroken. He still lived with her but claimed they barely spoke. Emily tried to keep the peace, but it was impossible. Our mother was facing serious charges, attempted fraud, forgery, and a slew of related offenses. She tried to contact me again, but my lawyer advised me not to respond. The legal process dragged on for months. During this time, I focused on my son. Watching him grow became my primary source of joy. I found a therapist who helped me process the betrayal I felt. My mother's actions had shattered any illusions I had about her. Therapy gave me space to grieve the mother I wished I'd had and accept the reality of the one I did. There was no going back. Forgiveness wasn't on the table. I wanted her punished, and I felt no remorse about it. That clarity empowered me to keep fighting relentlessly. Eventually, the case went to trial. My mother sat across the courtroom, looking composed in her expensive suit. She'd hired a new lawyer by then, someone with a reputation for being aggressive. I felt a surge of anger every time I looked at her, remembering how she tried to take my baby from me. The prosecution presented the evidence, recorded statements from the adoption agency, the forged forms, and even bank records showing my mother had paid certain fees in advance. My mother's lawyer tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who misunderstood her mother's intentions. I testified, recounting every detail of what had happened. The judge and jury heard how I discovered the scheme, the forged signatures, and my mother's threatening messages. The defense tried to rattle me by bringing up family issues, suggesting I was exaggerating out of spite. But the facts spoke for themselves. My mother had no excuse for forging my signature on legal documents. It was a clear violation of the law. The adoption agency representatives confirmed everything, leaving the defense little room to maneuver. By the end of the trial, it was obvious where the truth lay. The jury deliberated for a day before reaching a verdict. My mother was found guilty on multiple counts, including forgery and attempted fraud. She wasn't taken into custody immediately. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date. I felt a rush of vindication, but it was tinged with sadness. This was my mother after all, but she'd crossed a line I couldn't overlook. The rest of my family was torn. Some believed justice had been served, others blamed me for not keeping it in the family. Regardless, I had no regrets. My child's safety and well-being came first. When sentencing day arrived, my mother appeared in court with the same defiant attitude. She read a statement declaring her love for me and her grandchild, insisting that she'd only tried to do what she believed was best. The judge was unmoved. The evidence of her deliberate actions was overwhelming. She was sentenced to serve time in prison, along with fines and mandatory counseling. The moment the gavel came down, I felt a surreal sense of closure. My mother, the person who tried to steal my baby's future, was finally facing the legal consequences of her actions. Justice. My father tried to convince me to visit her in prison. He said she was remorseful, that she wanted to apologize. But I remembered the countless chances she'd had to stop or come clean. She never did. She only doubled down when I resisted her plans. As far as I was concerned, she wasn't welcome in my life or my child's. My father was torn up about it, but he respected my boundaries. Emily reached out occasionally, updating me on how our mother was doing, but I cut those conversations short. I had no interest in her remorse. In the months following her conviction, I focused on rebuilding my life. I went back to work, and my husband and I found a new routine. We attended more therapy sessions, strengthening our relationship and fortifying our resolve to protect our family. My son was thriving, hitting milestones, and bringing light into every day. Occasionally, I'd hear a new rumor about how my mother was blaming me for her downfall, but I refused to let it get to me. She had tried to ruin my life and my baby's future, and she deserved every consequence she received. Legally, the matter was settled, but emotionally, I was still healing. My mother had betrayed me in a way that felt almost unimaginable. She hadn't just hurt me, she attempted to orchestrate a future where my baby would be raised by strangers. The only solace I found was in the knowledge that she was held accountable. I wasn't interested in any reconciliation or closure talk. My mother had shown me exactly who she was, and I believed her. The courts may have decided her fate, but in my eyes, she had sentenced herself to permanent exile from my life. People often describe revenge as a dish best served cold, but in my case, it was a matter of survival. My mother showed me who she was, a woman willing to betray her own daughter to maintain a facade of a perfect family event. I didn't seek her destruction out of petty spite. I sought legal recourse because she threatened my child's future, and I'd do it again if I had to. There's no making amends for trying to place someone's newborn for adoption behind their back. At least now, she can't harm my family any further. That's my story. My mother is convicted, serving her sentence, and I have no intention of ever letting her back into my life. She tried to take my baby away because she couldn't stand the thought of someone else receiving attention during my sister's wedding season. I hope she realizes the depth of her wrongdoing, but even if she doesn't, I'm at peace. My son is safe, my husband and I are stronger than ever, and I've learned that I don't owe anyone forgiveness. Justice was served, and I have no regrets. That's how I took my life back. I couldn't be happier with the outcome.